The night was cold and still. The city streets nearly empty except for the hum of occasional passing cars. Street lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. Isaiah Cole walked slowly down the block, his posture straight despite the years of wear on his body. He had just left a small veterans gathering at the community center, a quiet event honoring those who had served. His jacket was plain, but on the inside pocket rested a small pin, an eagle-shaped insignia gifted to him years ago by someone few would believe he knew personally. He kept his head down, hands in his coat pockets. The streets at this hour were quiet, but not always safe. From the corner, a patrol car pulled up, headlights sweeping over Isaiah like a spotlight. The cruiser stopped abruptly. "Hey!" a voice barked from inside. Isaiah turned slowly, his calm gaze meeting the glare of the headlights. Officer Derek Mills stepped out, his face hardened, his hand already resting near his baton. "What are you doing out here?" "Walking home," Isaiah replied, his tone even. "This is a restricted area after dark," Mills said sharply. "ID, now." Isaiah reached into his pocket deliberately and pulled out his wallet, offering it without a word. Mills snatched it, glancing at the ID, then back at Isaiah. "Isaiah Cole," he muttered. "Where you headed?" "2 blocks down. My home," Isaiah answered quietly. Mills smirked faintly. "Funny. Don't see many people like you living around here. You sure you're not looking for trouble?" Isaiah's eyes narrowed slightly. "I told you, I'm going home." "Step over to the curb," Mills ordered. "There's no need," Isaiah replied calmly. Mills's jaw tightened. "I said, step over to the curb." His hand moved to his baton, gripping it tightly. Isaiah didn't move. He wasn't defiant, just composed, the way a man who had faced far worse learned to be. But Mills didn't see composure. He saw resistance. In an instant, Mills swung the baton, striking Isaiah in the ribs. The veteran stumbled slightly, but didn't cry out. "Why," Isaiah began, but another blow came, harder this time. "Don't you talk back to me," Mills barked, his voice echoing off the empty street. Isaiah fell to one knee, the pain sharp but his dignity unbroken. He looked up, his voice low but steady. "You don't know who I am." "I don't care who you are," Mills snapped, raising the baton again. But just as it came down, something metallic slipped from Isaiah's coat pocket. A small pin shaped like an eagle. It clattered onto the pavement with a sharp sound. Mills paused, frowning. He picked it up and froze. It was the Presidential Medal of Freedom, engraved with a signature he recognized instantly. The President of the United States. For a moment, Mills just stared at the pin in his hand. The golden eagle gleamed faintly under the streetlight. Its wings spread wide, a symbol he'd only ever seen on TV during major ceremonies. Below it was an engraved inscription, in honor of extraordinary service and dedication. And beneath that, a signature unmistakable even in the dim light, President Jonathan Reed. Mills blinked, his grip on the baton loosening. What is this?" he muttered. Isaiah slowly rose from his knee, his breathing calm despite the sharp ache radiating from his side. His eyes stayed locked on Mills, unwavering. "That," he said evenly, "was a gift. From a man you clearly respect more than you respect me." Mills swallowed hard. "The president? You're telling me he gave you this?" Isaiah tilted his head slightly. I don't need to tell you. The signature speaks for itself. Mills looked back down at the metal, his heart pounding. His mind scrambled, connecting pieces he hadn't even considered. You're, he started, but Isaiah cut him off quietly. I'm a man who served this country long before you ever put on that badge. I've bled for it, watched friends give everything for it, and I came home to streets like this, to men like you, who see only what they want to see. Mills stepped back, suddenly unsure of himself. His earlier bravado drained from his face, replaced with something else. Confusion, maybe even fear. Why didn't you say anything? Mills asked, his voice quieter now. Isaiah's lips curved into the faintest, coldest smile. Because I shouldn't have to. The weight of those words hung heavy in the empty street. In the distance, a car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the two men, one holding a symbol of honor he didn't deserve to touch, the other standing silently, the image of resilience. Mills finally lowered the baton completely. He held out the pin awkwardly. I didn't know. Isaiah took the medal back with careful fingers, brushing a speck of dirt off it before tucking it back into his coat. Exactly, he said softly. You didn't know. And because you didn't know, you assumed the worst. Mills opened his mouth, searching for words, but nothing came. Isaiah turned slightly, glancing down the street toward his home. What if I wasn't your definition of important? He asked quietly. What if I wasn't a friend of the president? Would I just be another man you left bleeding on the curb? Mills had no answer. The silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said. Isaiah began to walk away, his steps slow but firm. He didn't look back. Mills watched him disappear into the shadows of the street, the sound of his footsteps fading. He felt the weight of the baton in his hand, suddenly heavier than it had ever been before. For the first time in years, Mills questioned not just his actions, but himself. Isaiah turned the corner and disappeared into the quiet night, his figure swallowed by the shadows. The only sound left behind was the faint echo of his deliberate footsteps. Mills stood frozen beside his patrol car, gripping the baton that moments ago had struck a man he didn't truly see. He glanced down at his hands, suddenly aware of how empty his authority felt in that moment. The silence pressed against him like a weight he couldn't shake. He replayed the entire encounter in his head, the assumptions, the tone, the violence that came so easily. And then that small piece of metal, a simple pin, had unraveled everything he thought he knew about the man he'd just hurt. Mills finally slid the baton back into his belt. He sat in the driver's seat of the cruiser, staring blankly out at the empty street. The radio crackled with routine chatter, but he didn't respond. Meanwhile, Isaiah walked the remaining blocks to his home, each step slow but steady despite the pain radiating through his ribs. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment, breathing deeply. He wasn't surprised by what had happened. Not anymore. But the ache in his side reminded him that no matter what he'd done for this country, some people would never look past the surface. Inside his modest living room, Isaiah removed his coat carefully. He sat down on the edge of the couch, pulling the pin from his pocket. It gleamed faintly in the soft lamplight. He turned it over in his hands, not with pride, but with a quiet sense of irony. It wasn't the first time this medal had spoken for him when words couldn't. Across the city, Mills couldn't sleep. Long after his shift ended, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the badge lying in front of him. His wife had asked if he was okay, and he just nodded silently. His reflection in the darkened window didn't look like the man he thought he was. The next day, Isaiah visited the VA hospital. He checked in on a few old friends who were recovering, sitting with them in quiet solidarity. They talked about mundane things, sports, the weather, but the unspoken bond between them was stronger than any words. Isaiah, one of the younger veterans, said, "You've always been the calm one. Don't you ever get tired of staying calm?" Isaiah smiled faintly. "Calm doesn't mean I'm not tired. It means I refuse to let their noise become my noise." Later that afternoon, Mills parked outside the police station, still conflicted. He pulled out his report from the night before. It was standard, sterile, routine stop, no incident, but he couldn't turn it in like that. For the first time in his career, Mills wrote the truth. Stopped a man without cause, used unnecessary force, misjudged him completely, found out he was a decorated veteran and personal acquaintance of the president. He stared at the page. It felt heavier than anything he'd ever submitted. When he finally turned it in, he knew there would be consequences. But maybe, he thought, there should be. The following morning, the precinct buzzed with its usual routine: officers exchanging stories, filling out reports, sipping coffee before heading out. But when Mills walked in, there was a weight in his steps that hadn't been there before. He handed the report to his supervisor without a word. The man glanced at it briefly, his brow furrowing almost immediately. "What's this?" the supervisor asked. "It's what happened," Mills said quietly. The supervisor's eyes scanned the lines, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "You're admitting you assaulted a civilian during a traffic stop?" "Yes," Mills replied. His tone didn't waver. The supervisor leaned back in his chair, staring at Mills. "Do you realize what you're saying? This could cost you your badge." Mills hesitated for a moment. "Maybe it should," he said finally. Meanwhile, across town, Isaiah sat at his kitchen table, slowly sipping his morning coffee. He winced slightly as he shifted in his chair, the bruises from the night before still tender. But he didn't dwell on them. Instead, he reached for a worn notebook, jotting down a few thoughts, a habit he'd picked up during his years of service. Outside his window, the neighborhood was waking up. Children were walking to school, neighbors greeting one another with casual waves. Life went on, unaware of the quiet battle he'd endured the night before. Later that day, Isaiah visited a community center where he volunteered. He spent hours talking with younger veterans, guiding them through job applications, listening to their struggles. For them, he was a mentor, a steady presence who understood their silence without needing explanations. In one corner, a young man named Marcus spoke softly. "Sometimes it feels like nothing we did matters, like we came back invisible." Isaiah gave him a steady look. "You're not invisible. The world just forgets to look. But that doesn't mean you stop standing tall." Marcus nodded slowly, comforted by the quiet conviction in Isaiah's voice. Back at the precinct, the ripple from Mills's report began to spread. Word traveled fast. Officers whispered in the hallways, unsure how to react. Some dismissed it as a foolish move. Others, though they wouldn't say it out loud, felt a pang of reflection in the pit of their stomachs. By evening, Mills was called into the captain's office. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" the captain asked, his tone sharp. "Yes," Mills answered calmly, "but it was the truth, and it needed to be said." The captain studied him for a long moment. "You'll be placed on leave while this is reviewed. There will be an inquiry." Mills nodded. He had expected it. As he left the office, he felt strangely lighter, not because he was free of guilt, but because he had finally stopped hiding from it. That night, Mills drove to the park where the Veterans Memorial stood. It was quiet, the stone illuminated by soft lamplight. He stood there in silence, reading the engraved names. He didn't know if Isaiah would be there. He didn't even know if he deserved to see him again. But he stayed, hoping for the chance to try. The park was empty, except for the soft glow of the memorial lights. Mills stood there for a long while, his hands buried in his jacket pockets, his eyes scanning the names etched into the cold stone. Each one felt like a quiet rebuke, a reminder of sacrifices far greater than anything he had ever given. Behind him, footsteps approached slowly. Mills turned to see Isaiah walking toward the memorial with his usual calm stride. His coat was buttoned against the evening chill, and in his hand he carried a single white flower. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment neither man spoke. Isaiah stopped a few feet away. "You're here," he said simply. "I needed to be," Mills replied. His voice was quiet, stripped of the harshness it once carried. Isaiah stepped closer to the memorial, crouching slightly to place the flower at its base. He rested his hand gently on the stone for a moment, his expression unreadable. Mills watched silently. When Isaiah stood again, Mills finally spoke. "I filed a report." Isaiah raised an eyebrow slightly. "I told the truth about what happened," Mills continued, "about how I stopped you, about what I did." Isaiah studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. "And what happens now?" "I'm on leave," Mills admitted. "They're reviewing it. Might lose the badge." Isaiah's gaze didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. "And how do you feel about that?" Mills exhaled slowly. "Like it's overdue, like it's what I deserve." The veteran looked back at the memorial, his voice calm but carrying quiet weight. "Deserve doesn't always matter. What matters is what you do with the lesson after it's been learned." Mills nodded, his throat tightening. "I don't expect forgiveness." Isaiah gave a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I'm not the one you need it from. It's bigger than me." The two men stood in silence for a while, the faint rustle of leaves the only sound between them. After a moment, Isaiah spoke again, his tone softer now. "You know, the man whose name I visit here, he saved me once. He didn't hesitate, didn't stop to think about who I was. He just saw someone who needed help. That's what honor looks like." Mills swallowed hard, his eyes shifting back to the engraved names. "I want to be better than who I've been." "Then start," Isaiah said simply. Isaiah turned to leave, his calm presence still commanding even in quiet departure. Mills didn't try to stop him. He just watched as the man walked away, the white flower lying at the base of the memorial like a silent promise. As Mills stood alone, he realized the lesson wasn't about the medal, or even the president's connection. It was about seeing the humanity in someone before that you were given a reason to. And now, there was no going back to who he had been before. Isaiah walked away from the memorial with the same measured pace he had arrived, his coat gently swaying in the evening breeze. He didn't look back, but he didn't need to. He knew Mills was still there, lingering in the weight of what had been left unsaid. The park grew quiet again, leaving Mills alone with the engraved names. He reached out and placed his palm on the cool stone. He didn't know any of the men or women listed there, but for the first time, he felt the gravity of what they represented. He whispered softly, as if to himself, "I'm sorry." Back at his car, Mills sat in silence before starting the engine. He didn't drive home right away. Instead, he circled the city aimlessly, his thoughts replaying the entire chain of events. The stop, the blows, the moment the metal hit the ground and shattered the false certainty he'd carried for years. Meanwhile, Isaiah returned home and placed his coat neatly on the chair. He eased himself onto the couch, feeling the dull ache in his ribs. He didn't complain. Pain was something he'd learned to live with long ago. He reached for a small wooden box on the coffee table, opened it, and gently placed the metal pin back inside. The box already held other mementos: dog tags, a faded photo of his unit, a folded letter yellowed with time. As he closed the box, Isaiah sighed softly. "It shouldn't take a symbol like this to remind someone of my worth," he thought. The next morning, Mills stood in front of the precinct captain again. His report had triggered a formal review. There would be hearings, possibly charges. "You understand the consequences," the captain said. "Yes," Mills replied firmly. "And you still want this to go through?" "I do," Mills said, "because hiding it would make me worse than I already was." The captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Go home. We'll call you when the board meets." As Mills left the station, he felt an odd mixture of dread and relief. For once, he wasn't running from accountability. Later that day, Isaiah visited the community center. Carl and a few other younger veterans were there, talking quietly. When they saw Isaiah, they straightened a little, comforted by his calm presence. "Sir," Carl said, "I heard about what happened. Are you okay?" Isaiah gave a faint smile. "I've been through worse, but it's not about me. It's about what we carry and how the world chooses to see it or not see it." Carl nodded slowly. "So what do we do?" Isaiah looked at him steadily. "We keep walking. We keep living with dignity, because that's how you win against people who want to make you small." That evening, Mills found himself back at the diner. He sat in the same booth, staring at the same empty seat across from him. The waitress poured him coffee and said nothing, sensing the heaviness in his silence. He thought of Isaiah again, his calm voice, his unwavering composure, even in pain. And Mills realized something. Change wasn't about grand gestures. It started quietly, in the decision to never look at someone the same careless way again. Outside, the sun set slowly, casting long shadows across the city. The diner felt almost empty that evening. Mills sat in silence, his coffee cooling slowly in front of him. He stared at the reflection in the dark liquid. His own face, tired and hollow. The weight of the coming investigation loomed over him. But strangely, he didn't feel regret for filing the report. He only regretted the moment that had made it necessary. He glanced toward the corner booth where he had once seen Isaiah sitting, calm and unshaken. The memory replayed with sharp clarity, the veteran's steady gaze, the quiet words that had cut deeper than any shout ever could. Respect shouldn't depend on what you see after the fact. Meanwhile, Isaiah was at the Veterans Center, sitting with a small group of younger soldiers. The room was filled with soft voices and the occasional subdued laugh. Carl spoke up, glancing toward Isaiah. "Do you ever think it'll really change?" Carl asked. "How people look at us?" Isaiah leaned back slightly, his voice even. "Change isn't a single moment. It's a series of small ones. It's slow, but it comes if enough people decide to see differently." Carl nodded, though the weight in his eyes remained. Later that evening, Isaiah walked home. The streets were quiet, the glow from the streetlights pooling on the pavement. As he reached his front door, his phone buzzed. A message from an old friend in Washington. "The president heard what happened. He wants to talk. Says it shouldn't have come to this." Isaiah stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down. He didn't want this to become a political spectacle. He didn't need the president's intervention to validate what he already knew. His worth wasn't tied to anyone's recognition. Across the city, Mills drove past the precinct, the familiar building now feeling foreign. He parked near the same park where the memorial stood. The night air was cool, and the faint glow of the engraved names beckoned him. He walked to the stone and stood there quietly, reading the names again. For the first time, he imagined the lives behind each one, the families waiting for them, the sacrifices made without promise of reward. While standing there, he noticed another man approach the memorial slowly. It wasn't Isaiah this time, but an elderly veteran holding a small candle. The man knelt, placed the candle gently at the base, and whispered a prayer. Mills stepped back, giving him space, feeling like an intruder in a place of reverence. When he returned to his cruiser, Mills sat in the driver's seat for a long while, gripping the steering wheel. He thought about his own oath as an officer and how far he'd drifted from its true meaning. At home later, Mills removed his badge and set it on the table beside his keys. For years, it had been his shield. Now, it felt like a mirror reflecting the kind of man he still needed to become. Isaiah, at that same hour, sat quietly in his living room. He opened the wooden box with the medal once more, holding it gently. He thought of the friend who had given it to him, of the promise it carried, not of honor, but of responsibility. And in two different rooms, two men carried the same silence, each understanding in his own way that the real battle was not what had happened, but what they chose to do after. The next morning, Isaiah woke before sunrise. Old habits never left him. He moved with quiet precision, brewing a small pot of coffee and sitting by the window as the city began to stir. The medal lay on the table beside him, catching the faint glow of early light. He didn't look at it often, but when he did, it reminded him of the weight of service. Not the glory, but the sacrifice. He thought about the message from Washington. He knew the president would call, and he knew what it would mean. Public attention, cameras, statements. But this wasn't about making an example of one officer. It was about the quiet, everyday choices people made when no one was watching. Meanwhile, Mills sat in his car outside the precinct, staring at the building's familiar brick walls. He couldn't bring himself to go inside yet. He had already been placed on leave, and the review board would meet in a few days. He knew the outcome wouldn't be simple. His phone buzzed with a message from Mike. "They're talking about you. You sure you want to go through with this?" Mills typed back after a long pause. "Yes, it's the only way forward." He started the engine and drove aimlessly for a while, the city passing by in blurred motion. He found himself near the Veterans Center without even realizing it. Outside, a few men in plain jackets lingered, talking quietly. Mills watched from the car for a moment before parking. Inside, Isaiah was speaking with a small group, helping them with paperwork for a new support program. He noticed the officer standing hesitantly at the door, but didn't react. Mills stepped inside slowly, his presence drawing a few wary glances from the veterans. He approached Isaiah, unsure how to begin. "I needed to see you," Mills said finally. His voice was softer than before, stripped of the authority it once carried. Isaiah looked up calmly. "Why?" "I wanted you to know. I didn't try to bury it," Mills said. "The report, it's out. They're reviewing it. I'll take whatever comes." Isaiah studied him for a long moment. "And what do you expect me to say?" "Nothing," Mills admitted. "I just wanted you to know I'm not pretending it didn't happen." Isaiah nodded slowly, then turned back to the papers on the table. "Change doesn't start with words. It starts with what you choose to do after." Mills swallowed, accepting the quiet dismissal. As he left the Veterans Center, Mills noticed the memorial wall in the lobby. He paused, reading the names etched into the plaque. His reflection stared back at him in the polished metal, and for the first time, he truly saw the gap between the man he had been and the man he wanted to be. Outside, Isaiah finished his conversation with Carl. The young veteran watched Mills leave through the window. "Who was that?" Carl asked quietly. "Someone learning to see," Isaiah replied calmly. That evening, Mills didn't go home right away. Instead, he returned to the park memorial again. The same white flowers Isaiah had left still resting at the base. He stood there in the fading light, realizing that some lessons would take a lifetime to carry. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the park as Mills stood quietly before the memorial. The names carved into the stone seemed to stare back at him, each one representing a life he'd never known, sacrifices he'd never fully understood. The soft breeze carried the faint sound of children playing somewhere nearby, a sharp contrast to the stillness of the moment. Mills thought about how many times he had driven past this place without ever stopping. To him, it had always been just another monument. But now, it felt different, alive, with the weight of what it meant. He crouched briefly, brushing a stray leaf from one of the engraved names. "I didn't see before," he whispered quietly, unsure who he was speaking to. "But I see now." Meanwhile, Isaiah was at home, tidying up the small wooden box where he kept the medal. He placed it back on the shelf beside a photograph of himself in uniform, standing alongside his old unit. The faces in the picture were younger, full of strength and purpose. Many of them were gone now. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Isaiah picked it up. "Isaiah," came a warm, familiar voice on the other end. "It's Jonathan." It was the president. "I heard what happened," President Reed said softly. "I'm sorry. It shouldn't have come to this. You deserve better than that, my friend." Isaiah smiled faintly, though his tone remained calm. It's not about me, it's about what it shows, about what still hasn't changed. There was a pause on the other end. Would you let me make this public? People need to know what happened. Isaiah shook his head, even though the president couldn't see him. No, I don't want it to be about a headline. If people are going to change, it has to come from inside them, not from a story that fades in a week. President Reed sighed softly. You've always been a better man than most, Isaiah. If there's anything I can do, you know I will. I know, Isaiah replied. Take care of the ones who can't speak for themselves. That's enough. After hanging up, Isaiah sat back in his chair. He stared at the quiet room around him, letting the stillness settle. Later that night, Mills returned home. He sat at his kitchen table with his badge lying in front of him. It no longer felt like an emblem of authority. It felt like a question he had to answer every day. What kind of man will I be when I wear this? He thought about Isaiah's calm voice, the way he hadn't raised it even while in pain. That quiet strength haunted Mills more than any anger ever could. Before heading to bed, Mills wrote a note and pinned it on his refrigerator. See first, judge never. It was simple, but it was a start. A reminder he wanted to face every single day. And across the city, Isaiah sat on his porch under the night sky, breathing in the cool air. He didn't need to know what Mills was doing now. The encounter had already done what it needed to do. Change was never loud. It began in silence, in the choices made when no one was watching. The next morning dawned clear and cool, sunlight spilling over the city in soft gold. Isaiah began his day the same way he always did, with quiet discipline. He brewed coffee, stretched gently to ease the stiffness in his ribs, and then sat on the porch, letting the early calm settle over him. As he sipped his coffee, he saw a neighborhood boy ride past on his bike, waving cheerfully. Isaiah raised a hand in return, offering a small smile. Moments like that reminded him why he chose to live quietly, away from the noise of politics and the spotlight that could have easily followed him after his service. Meanwhile, Mills was already awake, sitting in his living room with the blinds half open. The note he had pinned to the refrigerator, see first, judge never, kept catching his eye. He replayed his conversation with Isaiah at the Veterans Center, remembering the calm way the man had said, change doesn't start with words. It starts with what you choose to do after. Those words stuck with him like an echo he couldn't ignore. Later that day, Mills drove to the Youth Outreach Center in the city, a place he'd rarely visited during his years as an officer. He walked inside, not in uniform, just as himself. He approached the director, a middle-aged woman with kind but tired eyes. I'd like to volunteer, Mills said. I want to talk to the kids, maybe teach them how to stay safe during interactions with the police, and maybe teach myself how to do better. The woman studied him carefully, recognizing both the sincerity and the weight behind his words. She nodded. We always need people willing to listen and willing to learn. That afternoon, Mills sat in a small room with a dozen teenagers. They were wary at first, skeptical of the man in front of them. But Mills didn't lecture. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He just spoke honestly. I've been a cop for a long time, he began. And I'll be honest, sometimes I saw what I wanted to see. not what was really there. That was wrong. I'm trying to change that, and I'm here to listen to you. The room stayed quiet for a while, but eventually, one of the kids spoke up. Then another. Slowly, a conversation began, hesitant but real. Meanwhile, Isaiah spent his afternoon at the park, sitting near the memorial again. He watched families pass by, some stopping to read the names. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. A silent tribute to the men who would never walk these paths again. As evening fell, Mills drove past the park and noticed Isaiah sitting there, alone but steady. He didn't stop this time. He didn't need to. He knew their paths had already crossed in the way they were meant to. That night, Isaiah placed the medal back in its wooden box and closed it gently. He didn't need it to define who he was. He already knew. And somewhere across the city, Mills stared at his badge on the table, knowing it was no longer just a symbol of power, but a promise he had to earn, one choice at a time. The days began to take on a quiet rhythm. Isaiah continued his visits to the Veterans Center, offering calm guidance to younger soldiers still trying to find their footing in civilian life. His presence there was steady and reassuring. He didn't need to speak much to be understood. Carl, the young veteran Isaiah had been mentoring, approached him one afternoon with a faint smile. "I signed up to help at the outreach program. Figured if you can give your time, so can I." Isaiah nodded approvingly. "That's how we honor those who didn't make it back. We keep helping each other." Meanwhile, Mill's suspension continued. Without the daily structure of patrols, he found himself with long stretches of time to think. He returned to the youth center every few days, continuing the conversations he'd started with the teens. At first, they didn't trust him, and Mills didn't blame them. But slowly, they began to ask him questions, not about the law, but about how he had changed. "Why now?" one boy asked. "Why not before?" Mills looked down at his hands, taking a deep breath before answering. "Because I didn't see clearly before. I thought wearing a badge meant I understood everything. It didn't. It just made me stop asking questions. I can't undo that, but I can choose differently now." Later that week, Mills received a letter from the precinct. It was the official notice. His suspension was extended pending a full review. He'd likely face disciplinary action. He knew it might end his career, but oddly, he felt a sense of peace with it. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of consequences. That evening, he drove to the same diner where everything had shifted for him. The waitress gave him a small nod of recognition. He sat in the booth, staring at the empty seat across from him, remembering the quiet strength Isaiah had shown even after being wronged. Meanwhile, Isaiah sat at home that same evening, staring at a letter he'd received from Washington. It was another invitation from the president, not for a public ceremony, but for a private dinner to discuss ways to improve community trust. Isaiah considered it carefully. He didn't want the spotlight, but he knew that sometimes showing up meant more than staying silent. He set the letter aside for now, choosing to sit on the porch and watch the sunset instead. The sky was painted in hues of orange and deep purple, the kind of beauty that reminded him life was still worth believing in. Across the city, Mills drove past the park where the memorial stood. He stopped briefly, looking at the faint white flowers Isaiah had placed there days ago. For a moment, he thought about stepping out, but instead, he stayed in the car, letting the stillness of the place sink into him. For both men, the encounter had become more than a moment. It was a mirror, forcing them to see who they truly were. And now, neither of them could turn away from the reflection. The next morning, Isaiah arrived at the Veterans Center earlier than usual. The building was still quiet, only a few staff setting up chairs for a community meeting later in the day. He liked the silence before the day began. It reminded him of the early mornings during deployment, calm moments that always came before the unknown. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed Carl helping another veteran fill out paperwork. There was a newfound steadiness in the young man's demeanor. Isaiah felt a quiet sense of pride. Small steps forward. That was what change looked like. Later, Isaiah sat in the courtyard outside the center, sipping his coffee, when a familiar face appeared. It was the center director, holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said. Isaiah took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. "Your calm changed me more than my fear ever could. Thank you for seeing the man I want to become, even when I couldn't see it myself. DM." Isaiah stared at the signature for a moment. He knew immediately who it was. He folded the note and tucked it into his jacket without a word. Meanwhile, Mills was at the Youth Outreach Center again. Today he wasn't just speaking, he was listening. A teenage girl raised her hand cautiously. "My brother got stopped last year for no reason. They treated him like a criminal. He still won't talk about it," she said softly. Mills felt a pang in his chest. "I'm sorry that happened," he said, "and I can't change what was done, but I can promise you I'm not here to defend it. I'm here to listen and to make sure I never repeat those mistakes." For the first time, the kids saw something different in him. Not an officer talking down to them, but a man owning his past. Later that day, Mills received another call from the precinct. His hearing was scheduled for the following week. He would have to face the review board, explain himself publicly, and accept their decision. He hung up the phone slowly, staring at the blank wall in front of him. He didn't know what his future in law enforcement would look like, but he knew he couldn't go back to who he was. That evening, Isaiah visited the park memorial again. He placed another white flower at the base and stood silently, his hand resting on the cold stone. He thought about the lives lost, the lessons learned too late, and the quiet ways healing could begin. Across the park, Mills stood at a distance, watching. He didn't approach this time, didn't interrupt. He simply watched the man who had unknowingly forced him to confront his own reflection. When Isaiah turned to leave, their eyes met briefly. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Both men walked away in opposite directions, carrying the same unspoken truth. Change is never instant. It is a choice, made quietly, day after day, and for the first time, both believed it was possible. A week passed quietly. For Isaiah, life returned to its familiar rhythm, though the ripples of that night on the street still lingered beneath the surface. He didn't talk about it with anyone, not at the Veterans Center, not with Carl, not even when Mrs. Daniels asked him why he seemed more tired than usual. "Just another day," he would say softly. Meanwhile, Mills spent his days suspended from duty, waiting for the formal hearing. He filled the time, volunteering at the youth center, staying later than required. At first, the kids kept their distance, wary of him. But over time, they started asking him real questions about what it was like to be a cop, about why officers made the decisions they did. One boy asked bluntly, "Have you ever hurt someone who didn't deserve it?" Mills paused, the weight of the question settling on him. "Yeah," he admitted quietly, "and it changed me. I can't erase it, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again." The room went silent, but the honesty left an impression. That evening, Isaiah sat on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. He thought again about the president's letter and the dinner invitation. Part of him wanted to decline, to stay in the quiet life he had built. But another part knew that silence didn't always protect others. Sometimes showing up mattered. He placed the letter back on the table and sighed. Across town, Mills sat at his kitchen table, staring at the formal hearing notice. It detailed the review process. Statements would be read, witnesses heard. There would be no hiding, no minimizing. He had already decided he wouldn't defend himself. He would tell the truth, fully, even if it ended his career. The next day, Mills returned once more to the park memorial. This time, he brought no badge, no uniform, just himself. As he stood there, he saw an older veteran sitting on a bench nearby, quietly feeding pigeons. Mills approached and sat at the other end of the bench. For a while, neither spoke. Then the veteran glanced at him and said, "You look like a man who's carrying something heavy." "I am," Mills admitted. "Then lighten it," the veteran said simply. "Start by doing better." The words were so simple, yet they mirrored what Isaiah had told him. Mills nodded slowly, feeling the strange comfort in hearing the same truth from another stranger. Later that evening, Isaiah returned to the Veterans Center. Carl handed him a flyer. "They're holding a community forum next week about police accountability. People are asking if you'll speak." Isaiah glanced at the paper, then looked back at Carl. "Would you?" Carl hesitated. "Me?" "Yes," Isaiah said. "Your voice matters. They need to hear it from more than one person." Carl's eyes brightened with a mix of fear and pride. "If you're there, I will." Isaiah smiled faintly. "Then I'll be there." And in that quiet promise, something began to shift. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the way that real change always starts. The day of the community forum arrived with a mix of tension and anticipation. Flyers had been posted around the city for days, and word had spread quickly. People came from all corners: residents, activists, veterans, even off-duty officers curious to see what would be said. The Veterans Center auditorium filled slowly, chairs scraping softly against the floor. A quiet hum of conversation floated through the air, but there was an undercurrent of something heavier: expectation. Isaiah stood off to the side, observing. He wasn't one for public speaking, but he had promised Carl he would be there. He believed in keeping his word. Carl stood nervously near the podium, holding a few handwritten notes. His hands trembled slightly, but Isaiah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Just speak the truth," Isaiah said calmly. "That's all anyone can ask of you." Meanwhile, across town, Mills sat in his car, staring at the flyer he'd picked up earlier in the week. He had no obligation to attend. In fact, his presence might stir more anger than anything else, but something pulled him toward the event. When he arrived, the parking lot was nearly full. He hesitated at the entrance, unsure if he had the right to be there. But then he saw Isaiah inside, standing with the quiet confidence that seemed to steady everyone around him. Mills slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. The forum began with a few brief introductions. Then Carl stepped up to the microphone. His voice shook at first, but as he spoke about his struggles after returning home from deployment and the feeling of being invisible to the very system he had served, his words grew stronger. "When we come back," Carl said, "we don't ask for special treatment. We just ask to be seen as people, not threats, not strangers, just people." The room was silent, absorbing every word. After Carl finished, the moderator invited others to speak. A few community members shared their stories, some about unfair treatment, others about moments of kindness that had restored their faith. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mills stood. The room shifted immediately. Some eyes narrowed, others turned away. But Mills didn't flinch. He walked to the microphone and looked out at the crowd. "I'm an officer," he began, his voice steady but heavy. "And I'm here because I failed. I saw a man, and I assumed the worst. I used my badge as a shield for my ignorance, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." The room stayed silent. "I can't undo it," Mills continued, "but I can tell you I'm trying to change. Not because I was caught, not because I was told to, but because one man's calm forced me to see the truth about myself. And I'm here to listen, if you'll let me." He stepped back, unsure if anyone would respond. Isaiah's eyes met his from across the room. He didn't nod, didn't smile, but his gaze was steady, and in that silent exchange, Mills knew he had taken the first real step towards something better. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after Mills stepped away from the microphone. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others exchanged cautious glances. It was rare to see an officer speak so openly about failure. Rarer still to see one admit it in front of a crowd like this. Finally, a woman in the audience stood. Her voice was calm but firm. "It takes something to admit you were wrong," she said, "but it takes more to prove it with your actions. We've heard words before. Now we need to see change." Mills nodded silently from his seat. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just listened. Carl spoke again, his voice steadier now. "That's why forums like this matter. Not to shame people, but to remind them that behind every uniform, behind every face you see for a second on the street, there's a story you don't know. We all have one." Isaiah stepped up next. The crowd hushed instantly, sensing the weight he carried without needing an introduction. "I'm not here to demand apologies," Isaiah began, his voice low but resonant. "I'm here to remind you that respect shouldn't be earned by medals or titles. It should be the starting point for every interaction, because you never know who someone is or what they've lived through." He paused, scanning the audience. His gaze lingered briefly on Mills, then moved on. "I served this country alongside men and women who gave everything. Some came back to welcome arms. Others came back to suspicion, to silence, to being treated as less than what they were. And that's not just a failure of individuals. It's a failure of all of us to see each other clearly." The room was utterly still. Even the shuffling and murmurs that usually filled the community meetings had vanished. Isaiah stepped back from the microphone. He didn't need to say more. His words carried the weight of lived experience, calm, unshaken, undeniable. When the forum ended, people lingered. Small conversations sparked about policy, about community programs, about what real accountability could look like. Mills stayed in the back, unsure if he should leave or stay. Then an older man approached him quietly. "You were brave to stand up there," he said. "But bravery isn't just admitting what you did. It's proving every day that you've changed." Mills nodded. "I know, and I will." Outside, Isaiah and Carl walked together toward the parking lot. Carl glanced at him. "Do you think it made a difference tonight?" Isaiah gave a faint smile. "Change doesn't happen in a single night. But tonight, we planted something. That's how it starts." Across the street, Mills watched them from a distance. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. He knew the real work wasn't in seeking approval. It was in what he would do next, quietly, without anyone watching. As the crowd dispersed and the lights in the community center dimmed, there was a sense, small but real, that something had shifted. Not resolved, not finished, but shifted. And sometimes that was enough to begin. The following morning, the city felt quieter than usual. Isaiah walked his familiar route to the park, the crisp air carrying the scent of damp grass. He stopped, as always, at the memorial and placed a single white flower at its base. His hand rested on the cool stone for a moment before he turned away. As he walked back toward the Veterans Center, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the president's office. "The offer still stands. We'd like you to join a panel on veterans issues and community trust. Your voice could change things." Isaiah stared at the message for a moment, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't answer right away. Change wasn't about grand gestures, he reminded himself. It was about what happened in small, quiet spaces, like the one he'd witnessed at the forum. At the Veterans Center, Carl was already there, setting up chairs for a morning meeting. When Isaiah walked in, the young man smiled. "They're still talking about what you said last night. I think it hit people harder than you realize." Isaiah nodded slightly. It wasn't about the words. It was about the truth in them. Truth is what sticks. Meanwhile, across town, Mills was at the Youth Outreach Center again. He'd returned without being asked, arriving early to help set up. He didn't wear his uniform anymore. It felt wrong now, like a costume that no longer fit. When the kids arrived, they greeted him with a little more trust than before. One boy approached and asked, "Are you really coming back every week?" "Yes," Mills said simply, "because I'm still learning too." Later that afternoon, Mills received a letter from the precinct. It was the final notice. His hearing date was set for the end of the week. He would stand before the review board and accept their judgment. He knew his career might end there, but he also knew this wasn't about saving his job anymore. It was about owning the man he had been and the one he was trying to become. That evening, Isaiah returned home and sat on his porch. He finally replied to the president's message. "I will join the panel, but only if it focuses on those who are unseen, not just those like me who have medals to show." Within minutes, a reply came. "That's exactly why we need your voice." Across the city, Mills stopped by the diner one more time. He sat in the same booth where he had once faced Isaiah and felt the shift that had started everything. The waitress poured him a coffee without asking. "You look different these days," she said gently. "Maybe I am," Mills replied. He didn't explain further. Some changes didn't need explanation. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Two men, once strangers bound by conflict, were now moving along separate paths, but each carrying a piece of the other's lesson forward. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, change was taking root. The day of Mills's hearing arrived with a gray, overcast sky. He woke early, unable to shake the knot in his stomach. His uniform hung in the closet, untouched. He decided he wouldn't wear it. He didn't feel like he had earned the right to anymore. Instead, he dressed plainly and drove to the precinct in silence. Inside the boardroom, a long table stretched under harsh fluorescent lights. 3 senior officers sat at the head, their faces stern, papers neatly stacked in front of them. Mills sat across from them, his hands folded, his gaze steady but humble. "Officer Mills," one of the board members began, "do you admit to the details you submitted in your own report?" "Yes," Mills said clearly. "You understand the gravity of admitting unnecessary force?" "Yes," he repeated, his tone unwavering. "And I accept whatever decision you make." There was a brief pause. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Mills shook his head slightly. "No defense. Only that I was wrong, and I'm working to change who I am beyond this badge. Whether or not I keep it isn't the point anymore." The board exchanged quiet glances before moving to their deliberation. Mills sat silently, knowing he had told the truth, and that was all he could offer. Meanwhile, at the Veterans Center, Isaiah was preparing for the upcoming panel with the president's advisors. Carl watched him, curious. "Are you nervous?" Carl asked. Isaiah gave a faint smile. "I've been through worse. Talking isn't the hard part. Making people listen, that's the challenge." Carl nodded. "You think it'll matter?" "It will," Isaiah said softly, "because even if it only changes one person, that one person can change someone else. That's how it starts." Later that afternoon, the review board called Mills back into the room. One of the senior officers cleared his throat. "Officer Mills, your actions were unacceptable and reflect poorly on the department. As a result, you are suspended without pay for 6 months, and you'll undergo mandatory re-renewal. After that, the board will reassess your position." Mills nodded slowly. Understood. As he left the room, a strange calm settled over him. It wasn't absolution, just the first step in paying the debt he owed. That evening, Mills returned to the Park Memorial. It had become a place of quiet reflection for him, a space to remind himself why respect should never be conditional. As he stood there, he noticed another familiar figure in the distance, Isaiah, walking toward the memorial with his usual quiet grace. Their eyes met briefly, and Isaiah gave a small nod. Mills nodded back, silently acknowledging that this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about continuing the work of change. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. The sun dipped low, casting a warm glow on the engraved names. Together, in quiet proximity, they stood honoring something far bigger than themselves. And in that stillness, the lesson lived on, not in words, but in the choices that would follow. The next morning, brought a soft rain that glazed the streets in silver. Isaiah stood on his porch, listening to the rhythmic patter against the roof. It was a peaceful sound, but it carried a certain weight too, like nature washing away the residue of yesterday's noise. He sat down with a warm cup of tea and opened a small notebook. In neat handwriting, he began jotting down thoughts for the panel discussion with the president's advisors. His words weren't meant to impress. They were meant to be honest. Across the city, Mills was at the Youth Outreach Center again, even though he was officially suspended. He had started showing up daily, helping organize programs, cleaning the rooms, and simply being present for the kids who had once been wary of him. One of the teens, a boy named Andre, approached him. "Are you still a cop?" he asked bluntly. "Not right now," Mills answered. "I'm on leave." "Are you coming back?" Mills hesitated. "I don't know. But even if I do, I'm not going to be the same as I was before." Andre studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good. We don't need more of the same." Later that day, Isaiah arrived at the Veterans Center to meet with Carl. Together, they reviewed the topics for the community forum they planned to co-host after the panel in Washington. "We can't just talk about veterans," Carl said thoughtfully. "We have to talk about how people see us and others like us." Isaiah agreed. "It's about the bigger picture. One story can open the door, but it's the broader truth that changes the room." Meanwhile, Mills stopped by the park memorial once again. He had begun visiting daily, using the quiet space as a reminder of humility. While he stood there, an older man approached him, a stranger wearing a faded military cap. "Did you serve?" the man asked. "No," Mills admitted softly. The veteran gave him a curious look. "Then what brings you here?" Mills thought for a moment before answering. "To remember that respect shouldn't have to be earned through pain. It should just be given." The older man nodded silently, as if understanding something unspoken, and walked away. That evening, Isaiah prepared his travel bag for Washington. He packed lightly, only bringing what he needed. As he closed the bag, he paused to look at the small wooden box containing the medal. He considered taking it with him, but decided to leave it. This trip, he thought, wasn't about who he was in the past. It was about what could still be changed in the present. Across town, Mills sat at his kitchen table with a notebook of his own. He wrote down every step he planned to take moving forward. Volunteering, retraining, listening more than he spoke. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a path. And in two separate homes, two men prepared quietly for the next steps of their journeys, each carrying a piece of the other's lesson forward. The morning of Isaiah's trip to Washington arrived quietly. The sky was pale and calm, the streets still waking. He locked his door, suitcase in hand, and paused for a moment on the porch. His eyes swept over the quiet neighborhood, a reminder of why he chose to live simply, away from attention. Carl was waiting outside in a car to drive him to the airport. As Isaiah got in, Carl asked, "Are you ready?" Isaiah gave a small nod. "Ready enough?" It's not about being comfortable. It's about showing up. The drive was silent for a while. Carl glanced at him again. "You think they'll listen?" "They'll listen," Isaiah said softly. "But what they do after? That's the real test. Meanwhile, Mills was at the youth center, helping Andre and a few other teens repaint a community room. He wore old clothes, splattered with flecks of blue paint. For once, he felt useful in a way that wasn't tied to authority. Andre smirked. You know you're terrible at painting straight lines, right? Mills chuckled quietly. Yeah, well, I'm still learning. About a lot of things. For a brief moment, the room filled with genuine laughter, an unfamiliar but welcome sound for Mills. Later that day, Mills drove past the park memorial again. He stopped his car and got out, standing silently before the stone names. But this time, he didn't stay long. He didn't need to linger. He had already begun carrying the lesson beyond this place. At the airport, Isaiah checked in for his flight. He moved calmly through the terminal, unnoticed by most. He didn't carry the medal with him. This journey wasn't about accolades. It was about speaking for the ones who couldn't. As he boarded, his phone buzzed with a message from the president himself. I'm grateful you're coming. Your perspective will guide us towards something better. Isaiah replied with a simple, see you soon. Back in the city, Mills sat at his kitchen table late that evening, reviewing the hearing date marked on his calendar. He felt the weight of what was coming, but didn't dread it anymore. Facing consequences was part of the path he'd chosen. Before going to bed, he picked up the folded note he'd written after his first encounter with Isaiah. See people as they are, not as who you've decided they are. He pinned it on the wall near his door, where he would see it every time he left the house. That night, in two different places, both men sat in quiet reflection. Isaiah, thousands of feet in the air, watched the clouds drift by from his airplane window. He thought of the community forum, the veterans, and the people who needed someone to remind them they weren't invisible. Mills, in his modest kitchen, thought about the same forum, about the quiet nod Isaiah had given him, the only acknowledgement he'd needed to keep trying. The next day would bring different challenges for each of them. But for the first time, their paths, though separate, were moving toward the same goal. A world that saw before it judged. The next morning, Isaiah arrived in Washington. The air was crisp, the city alive with its usual rush, but he moved through it with the same calm presence he always carried. A car from the White House picked him up and drove him to a private meeting room, not a press conference, not a staged event, but a quiet gathering of people who wanted to listen. Inside, President Jonathan Reed greeted him personally with a firm handshake. Isaiah, he said warmly, thank you for coming. Isaiah nodded. I'm not here for recognition. I'm here for the ones who can't stand in this room. They sat down at a round table with advisors, community leaders, and a few veterans. Isaiah spoke plainly about what happened, but he didn't center himself. He spoke of the larger truth, how dignity should never depend on status, medals, or titles. People shouldn't have to prove their worth to be treated like human beings, he said. It has to start with how we choose to see each other before any label is known. The room fell silent, everyone absorbing his words. The president nodded. We'll make changes, real ones, and your voice will guide that. Meanwhile, back in the city, Mills prepared for his hearing. He put on plain clothes again, refusing to hide behind a uniform. At the precinct, he walked into the review board meeting with his head held steady. Not in pride, but in acceptance. He told the truth once more, clearly and without excuse. I failed. I let bias guide me. I hurt a man who had already given more to this country than I ever will. I can't undo it, but I can be accountable for it. That's why I'm here. The board listened, some with hard expressions, others with quiet reflection. The outcome wasn't certain, but for Mills, the act of facing it honestly was already part of the change. Later that evening, Isaiah returned home from Washington. He stepped onto his porch, taking in the familiar quiet of his neighborhood. He didn't feel like a hero. He never had. He was just a man doing what he knew was right. Across town, Mills visited the youth center once more. He wasn't sure how long he'd have this time before the board's decision, but he wanted to keep showing up. For the kids, for himself. Andre greeted him at the door with a small smile. "You're back," Andre said. "Yeah," Mills replied softly. "I said I would be." That night, Isaiah walked to the park memorial again. Under the glow of the lamplight, he placed another single white flower at the base. As he stood there, he thought about the path both he and Mills had taken. Different lives, different choices, but connected by one moment of truth. He didn't know what the future would hold for the officer, and he didn't need to. The lesson had already been passed on, and somewhere Mills sat at his kitchen table, the note still pinned on his wall. See people as they are, not as who you've decided they are. Two men, two separate journeys, one quiet moment that changed them both.